Last night in Louisville, the police arrested the only Black legislator in the state legislature, Representative Attica Scott. The Democrat is charged with first-degree rioting, a Class D felony, which, ironically, or not really ironically at all, is the same level of felony that the cop who murdered Breonna Taylor has been charged with. Representative Scott is the sponsor of Breonna's law, which was passed by the Louisville City Council a few weeks ago. Now, this law bans no-knock warrants and calls for some other reforms that we can certainly argue whether they're sufficient or not in changing the nature of a fundamentally unjust institution, and that is policing. But the fact is that she introduced this law that directs police to operate differently, or allegedly operate differently, at least because we all know that laws are not constraints for the police in doing whatever they want and getting away with it. Because remember, chokeholds were already banned in most jurisdictions in this country. Now, the charges against Representative Scott stem from someone in the crowd of protesters throwing a flaming object at or into the window of the library in the area, which caused a little bit of damage, a broken window and maybe some ashes on the floor of the building. The building was not burned down, but you know how the empire values its property over people's lives and rights. And although there's no evidence that Representative Scott was the person who did this, she and everyone else arrested last night, over 150 people, were charged with first-degree riot, as well as unlawful assembly and failure to disperse, as protesters defied the 9 p.m. curfew that was imposed. But last night, the Louisville police did something even more disgusting. They surrounded the First Unitarian Church, intent on arresting those that went into the church seeking refuge. See, generally, places of worship are exempt from curfew orders, even emergency curfew orders. And as the Louisville Mayor Greg Fisher's office confirmed, the curfew does not apply to people commuting to work, house of worship for services, or seeking medical attention for themselves or others. And a representative of the First Unitarian Church, calls himself Brother Tim, said they had indeed opened their doors, saying, "The church has opened this up as a sanctuary, a place to get refreshments and legal aid if needed." Brother Tim and the Unitarians are people after the heart of Jesus and on the side of justice, let me tell you. But the system and its agents, the police, are not. Just like the protests in Denver and D.C. and New York and the brutal arrests that came from them are beginning to result in targeted raids of individuals and further arrests and federal charges that carry lengthy sentences, the arrests of protesters in Louisville, they're just generally as brutal as all the police responses to all the other protests across the country. But there's also a clear specter of targeted reprisal against people who would dare not accept these insulting charges and be placated, and what looks to me to be the intentional targeting of the one Black legislator who dared demand some level of accountability of the police. Now, we'd be foolish to think that the police didn't know who the only Black legislator in the state house is. And we'd be crazy to think that they didn't know that she is the one who introduced the law that was a result of a no-knock warrant that they served at the wrong address for a suspect that was already in custody, that they tried to make go away by smearing the victim of their malfeasance and her surviving boyfriend and her former boyfriend, trying to smear them to make this all go away. Of course they know who Representative Scott is. They may not know the ins and outs of the procedures of the Kentucky State House, but consider this. If the charges against Representative Scott stand and she's found guilty, she will not be able to vote in the upcoming legislative session. And even though the law she sponsored was passed unanimously by the Louisville City Council, there's been no indication as to whether the Kentucky legislature will even take up the bill. So if you still think the arrest of Representative Scott was a coincidence, then you really don't understand how fascism works and how it's always worked against those who challenge the system. And it's the same fascism that tried to take Brother Jalil Muntakim's life, but it failed this time. Because Muntakim, former Black Panther who was convicted in what we believe to be a sham trial for the murder of 2 cops in Harlem, has been in prison for 49 years and is finally being released on parole very shortly, next month. He was supposed to be released in April of this year when the New York State Supreme Court ordered it, but despite his ill health and age, he was kept locked up, where he's now contracted COVID-19, but he is still here. He'll be released next month, but he'll still be a target of a fascist state that wanted to kill him behind the walls, and it will not stop until it has him, even as we celebrate his freedom. And it's that same fascism that's coming after protesters across the country, unleashing brutal repression against oppressed people domestically and around the world who struggle to be free. It will not stop, so neither must we. George Jackson told us in Soledad, brother, settle your quarrels, come together, understand the reality of our situation, understand that fascism is already here, that people are dying who could be saved, that generations more will die or live poor, butchered half lives if you fail to act. We must act, my friends, and we must act now. Follow Lukman Nation on patreon.com/LukmanNation for lots of great content.